Got it.
And everybody make sure you've got the chat up so you can see it. And stick to 8 minutes, please.
All right, should we start? I'll just stop the music.
We've only got 40 people. Good evening. It's Paul Mason. I'm an economics journalist and Labour Party member. Welcome to this online seminar sponsored by Autonomy and Left 2030. Labour, Tax and Covid-19. A self-explanatory title, I hope. Now, we're still waiting for a few people to join via Zoom. It's Friday night, so a little bit late, but we will get cracking. Now is not the time for tax rises, says the Labour Shadow Chancellor, Annalisa Dodds. Having called for wealth taxes earlier this year, Labour's emphasis at the moment is on, as she says, preserving the tax base, that is, people, jobs, and businesses, for whom the winter is looking pretty bleak. In the background to this debate about what the left should do with fiscal policy is, of course, MMT, modern monetary theory, which says you don't really need tax rises to fund public spending at all. And while there haven't been many takers on the British left for this theory, it is the public awareness of it is rising, and I hope we'll be able to address some of the arguments coming out of that in the British context. Meanwhile, of course, there is ancient monetary policy, which is the Bank of England. So, the Bank of England are now Labour once toyed with changes to the bank's remit, but now the governor himself is speculating about negative interest rates, and the door does seem open to radicalism should Labour want to push it on the monetary policy front. So we've organised this seminar, and thank you to Autonomy for hosting it, with some of the left's most influential economists to talk these issues through. I'm going to do one-line intros as the speakers speak. I'll kind of list them now because I just want to maximise the time. We will finish at 8 on the dot because closing time is now 10 p.m. as you all know, and it is Friday night. So the speakers tonight in this order will be Gary Stevenson, Christine Berry, Shreya Nanda, Joe Michell, Robert Palmer, and James Meadway. And once they've all spoken, please fire your questions into the Q&A. One has already said, I thought this was about tax, not monetary policy. Well, we'll stick to tax, but I'm sure monetary policy will come into it. So I'm going to hand straight over now to Gary Stevenson, our first speaker. He's an inequality economist and former trader in London and Tokyo. Welcome, Gary.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Okay, so I'm going to talk about money printing as an alternative to taxation and the effect that it has on ordinary people. Now, so far in this crisis, government supports like the furlough scheme have been funded entirely through new money printed by the Bank of England. That's enabled the government to act very quickly, to be very nimble in providing support to the people that need it. And so far, at least, it hasn't caused any significant inflation. Because of that success so far, a lot of people have suggested that we should do more of it, or in fact, that we don't need to worry about tax rises or new taxes at all as a part of getting out of this crisis. Now, I'm going to argue against that on the basis that if we rely just on printing and not at all on taxes on the richest, it's going to cause serious economic damage to millions of ordinary families, especially the poorest in terms of housing affordability and social mobility. Now, I'm going to explain how that happens just simply through cash flows. So what cash flows have changed in the crisis so far? Well, the very first thing that changed was the non-essential sectors of the economy shut down. Restaurants, bars, tourism, this kind of stuff. They all shut down, and if they've reopened, they're running at a very reduced capacity. So what does that do to cash flows? Well, that means that the customers of the non-essential sector have stopped giving money to the businesses in that sector. That obviously means, like we've all seen, the businesses in that sector have started to lose a lot of money. But it also means that the customers have started to accumulate money. And I think that hasn't got as much attention as maybe it deserves. Now, that's very significant because remember, it's only the non-essential sectors of the economy that have shut down. Now, for ordinary people and lower income people, they don't actually spend very much of their outgoings on the non-essential sector. So when that sector shuts down, they don't actually save much money. But it's largely richer people who have higher spending overall, and especially higher spending in that sector. So when that sector shuts down, we start to see large amounts of money accumulate with mainly higher income and richer individuals. And that's very important to remember in how the whole thing is going to pan out. So that's the first effect. Businesses lose money and higher income individuals start to accumulate money. What are the second round effects? How do people react then? Well, the businesses, we know what they've done. They've turned around, they've tried to cut costs by laying off staff and reducing their wages. That then gets rid of another cash flow, which is wages, which moves the loss away from the business and onto workers. So now the loss is sitting with the workers and the businesses, and that's offset by cash which has been accumulated by the customers. Now, usually at this point, you would see a third round effect where the customers themselves stop spending money But under a printing setup, this is when the government steps in and provides support and prints money to replace the lost wages of these workers. Now, that's absolutely vital, and it's protected people who would otherwise have been desperate. But it's important to realize, whilst this protects the workers, it does nothing to prevent the accumulation of cash with richer people. That is still there. Now, the size of these schemes has been enormous. So far in this crisis, it's been 300 billion new pounds printed by the Bank of England. That's £4,500 for every man, woman, child, baby in the country. It's a huge amount of money. And if you haven't accumulated that money, that's probably because you are not one of the high income rich people who spend a lot of money in the non-essential sector. But that money is there. It's been accumulated by rich people. The question then obviously is that a problem? Now, I think supporters of a printing strategy are going to say, look, we know the rich are accumulating money, but look, the poorest are being supported. The rich are not spending it. It's not pushing inflation up. So it's not a problem. Now, I would agree with the first 3 points there. Yes, the poorest are being supported. That's the most important thing. Yes, it's not pushing inflation up. But just because these rich people are not spending the money doesn't disappear. If you give a huge amount of money to the richest people in society, they are going to invest that money. And in the US, that might mean buying stocks and shares. In this country, it means buying houses. And they will buy houses from largely poorer people who have maybe fallen through the gaps of the support network who need the money. So poorer families are going to be selling their properties to richer families. And at the same time, all the rich together are going to be buying at the same time. It's going to push property prices up. Now, both of those things, the movement of property from poorer families to richer families and the rising of prices of property massively increases inequality in the country. So the people who say that money printing doesn't cause inflation, I say, yeah, it's true. If the rich don't spend on goods and services, it doesn't cause inflation. But then they're spending on assets, and it will cause asset inflation. And to people who say we're not going to see asset inflation because we're going to see a very weak economy, just look back at 2008. We had a super weak economic recovery for 10 years, 12 years, and London house prices doubled. And some stock prices went up 300, 400%. I think that's going to happen again. I'm not just saying it, I'm betting on it because I'm pretty sure it's going to happen here. And look, some people out there who are pushing for just a printing strategy, don't raise taxes. You know, maybe some of those people own property, maybe their parents own property, maybe their families own property. If that's you, I want you to imagine how you would feel if you didn't own property and your parents and your family didn't own property. How would you feel pursuing a strategy that could make house prices double again? What is that going to do to the poorest families in society who don't own property? Look, it's already virtually impossible for those families to get housing. If house prices double again, it's going to become completely impossible. If we let that happen, the message we're sending to the poorest families in society is basically, it's game over for you. Your family will never own housing. Your kids won't own housing. Your grandkids, your great-grandkids will never own housing. That is what's going to happen if we don't include any tax rises in our strategy for getting out of this. You're talking about cutting half of society off from the bottom with no way back, renting forever, not just for their whole lives, but for generations. That's what we're talking about here. You know, I come from that kind of family. I come from that kind of background. So, you know, I can't just sit back and not say anything if that's what we're going to do. All right, so to conclude, money printing has been an excellent policy that has enabled government to support the people that need it quickly. But if we don't raise taxes on the richest at some point, they will have accumulated huge amounts of money. They will have bought assets such as houses from poorer and ordinary people, and those assets will be a lot more expensive. Inequality will have increased hugely. Ordinary families, especially poor families, will have lost any possibility of ever getting housing. Families in the middle, too, will find that their kids are going to struggle to afford housing. More and more people and families will find that they are forced into expensive rented accommodation for their entire lives. That is going to make people poorer, which is going to keep the economy in a slump for decades. Now, the only alternative to that economic disaster is to find a way to tax the richest in society. So yeah, we need to do that. Thank you. Oh, and if you want to see a detailed walkthrough of the cash flow analysis of how COVID is making the rich richer, there's a really clear video on my YouTube, Gary's Economics. Thank you.
Brilliant, Gary, and thank you for that. Can you, is it possible to post the link to the YouTube into the Q&A or the chat?
Yes, yes, I will now. Yeah.
Thanks, brilliant. Well, we'll come back. Obviously, there'll be questions arising around that. I'm going to flip to the next speaker now, which is Christine Berry. She is an independent researcher and writer based in Manchester. And I think, Gary, that was like almost dead on 8 minutes. Thank you. So if everybody can do 8 minutes, that'd be superb. And can you all, if you're not speaking, mute? Thank you. Christine.
Hi, thanks. And yeah, I'll do my best to stick to my 8 minutes. So I think we're in this slightly bizarre situation politically right now, that we've had a Tory government floating tax rises that has then basically been attacked both from the centre left and the radical left. From the centre left saying, you don't raise taxes in a recession, it's going to be bad for the economy. And then from parts of the radical left saying, basically, you don't need to raise taxes to fund government borrowing because you can just borrow or you can print money. And I think various other people on this call are going to deal with the second of those arguments that know much more about it than I do. So I'm not going to say too much about that. Except just to say, I think it is important to be clear that the argument here isn't about, so I don't think anyone on this call is going to argue that now is the time to be paying down the deficit, right? Everybody agrees borrowing rates are really low. The idea of what you would do with the money raised with additional taxes is you would use it to expand government spending rather than that you would use it to pay down the deficit. The argument, I guess, is that there are those who argue, well, you don't need to raise taxes to do that because you can just borrow or you can print money. And I think Gary's already, given some reasons why that might not be the case, and others are going to say much more about that. So I don't want to say very much more than that. I mainly want to focus in my 8 or 7 minutes I've got left on this other argument, you don't raise taxes in a recession, it's going to be bad for the economy. And I think you heard sort of a version of this argument from Lisa Nanda the other day in a broadcast interview where she was asked about Starmer's pledges on top rate of income tax, on corporation tax. And she said, look, when the economy's in a downturn, people are struggling to make ends meet, now's not the time to raise taxes. And I think whether this argument is true very much depends on what you're taxing and on what you do with the money. And I would also argue that if we're thinking about this, we absolutely have to be thinking about inequality and about the differential impacts of the COVID recession. And Gary's already done a really good job actually of explaining the first thing that I was going to talk about, which is when we look at incomes. Yes, Lisa Nandy's right that lots of people are struggling to make ends meet, but that's not everybody actually. And it's not just Gary's speculation. There is data now that demonstrates this. The Bank of England's done research on this. Shreya, who's going to talk later, and Laurie McFarlane worked on a report with me where they crunched the numbers on this. There are people at the top end of the income distribution that in cash terms are actually significantly better off now than they were at the start of the crisis because they can't spend money, which not only means that they're actually doing quite well and have a lot of cash to spare, but as Gary's argued, the economic impacts of that in terms of what they might do with that money could actually be quite damaging if it's invested in driving up the price of existing assets. So if you take that money away from those people and you spend it on things to help the people who genuinely are struggling to make ends meet, be that public job creation, be that debt relief, then there's a very strong argument, I think, to make that that would actually be good for the economy in terms of boosting demand, putting money in the pockets of people that are actually going to spend it rather than that are going to use it to invest in driving up the price of assets like housing. And I think that's not only true in terms of income, so we can also look at, for example, corporation tax. Like the argument, I suppose, that is usually made on that is that corporations, they are going to invest. It's a sort of supply side economic argument, right? That you don't want to tax corporations in a recession because you're going to discourage them from investing. But again, because we've got this economy that is so based anyway on rentier activity, on sweating assets, it's already the case that corporations don't really invest a lot in productive activity. They're much more likely to invest money in share buybacks, for example. And right now, with the uncertainty of COVID, with the uncertainty of Brexit, the idea that that money is going to be invested in productive activity that's going to support the economy, I think is a kind of dubious one at best. So even in general terms, I think there's at least an argument to be had about this idea of, well, like, could the state use that money better by investing it, for example, in job creation, actually investing it in productive activity that's going to support demand and support jobs and livelihoods. Within that, I think it's also worth looking at particular sectors of the economy that have done very, very well. So I'm thinking, for example, supermarkets, online retailers, whilst a lot of sectors of the economy, similar to individuals, right, whilst a lot of sectors of the economy have really suffered from the pandemic, there are some that have done really well out of it. And actually some of the spending that's been displaced, for example, from bars and restaurants and pubs, has been shifted into supermarkets, who as a result are doing really, really well. And some of them have also benefited from government support schemes that weren't really designed for them, that were designed for sectors that are struggling. And again, in the report we did for IPPR, Laurie pointed out there are historical precedents for excess profits tax in situations like that, specifically where you're in a very difficult economic situation. Lots of people and lots of sectors are struggling, but you recognise that there are particular actors and particular sectors that are actually doing pretty well. And so as a kind of burden shifting exercise, you impose windfall taxes on those people and transfer some of that money to the sectors and to the people that are struggling. And I think there's a really strong case to be made, you know, in narrative terms as well, to say, look, we should impose a windfall tax on supermarkets and use it for tackling food poverty, for example. I think that's an argument that makes sense and that would resonate with a lot of people and that makes economic sense as well. And the last group that I just want to talk about quickly is landlords, who are another obvious group that have done pretty well out the crisis, right? Because although we've accepted that it's reasonable for most other people in the economy to take a hit and to bear some of the cost of this shutdown. So for example, workers that are furloughed lose 20%, or most of them have lost 20% of their salary. We don't expect landlords, or we haven't so far expected landlords to take any hit to their income. And actually the Labour Party has taken the view that you can't ask landlords to take any kind of hit to their rental income, because that would leave you open to a challenge for breaching their human rights. So leaving aside the rights and wrongs of whether or not that argument holds, which I'm sure we can have a debate about, even if you buy that, even if that's true, you can still accept, and actually I think the Labour Party does accept, that it's unjust and unfair and probably quite bad for the economy, again, that landlords have borne none of the burden of this crisis and tenants have borne it all. And that is something that, again, you could address through the tax system, right? Through taxes on capital gains, on wealth, to kind of redistribute some of these gains that landlords are hoarding, and use them to help people that are struggling with rent debt, for example. And I think one of the important points to make about all this is, you know, as people on the left, we probably all think that reducing inequality is a good thing in itself. So even if you can make an argument that, well, you could pay for all of this stuff through printing money, or you could pay for it through borrowing, to me, you actually have to make quite a strong positive case for why it's better to do that than just to do it by taxing these wealthy actors at the top of the economy that are otherwise hoarding money, which, as Gary said, also has all kinds of other undesirable economic side effects. Rather than just taxing those people. And actually, I think this is something that the public instinctively gets. If you look at all the polling, I think maybe Robert is going to talk more about this, like there's huge public support, even amongst Tories, for tax rises, and particularly for these kind of tax rises, because I think people instinctively understand that this is what's going on. And in that respect, the left is kind of way behind where the public is at on this, and I think it really urgently needs to catch up, because it's just not particularly helpful. Let's not forget, just final point politically on this, regardless of the rights and wrongs of MMT, neo-Keynesianism, or these economic arguments, the reality is that we're up against a Tory government that is still quite strongly influenced by fiscal hawks. And so when they float tax rises, and the response of the left is not to say, no, you shouldn't be raising VAT, you should be taxing wealth, or you should be going further. But the response of the left almost uniformly is to say, no, that's a terrible idea, you shouldn't raise taxes. The political effect of that is actually to make spending cuts much more likely and to make further austerity more likely. And I think we need to recognise that. We need to recognise where the public's at. We need to recognise that the economics of it is not as simple as you don't raise taxes in a recession. And we need to take a much more nuanced position, taxing wealth, taxing excess profits, taxing top incomes. Thanks. I'm done.
Has Paul disappeared?
Paul. Lost Paul.
If we've lost Paul, then I think the next person is Shreya. Shreya, if you want to introduce yourself and kick off with your 8 minutes.
Of course. So hi, I'm Shreya. I'm an economist at the Institute for Public Policy Research. I'm very pleased to be here. So I wanted to talk briefly about a few things which our panelists have already touched on. So how taxes can be good for growth, why we need to raise taxes, and a little bit on MMT. If it gets too boring or if hard to follow, then please heckle me via the chat box. So how can tax be good for growth? So normally the argument is that taxes are bad for growth because they can deter productive economic activity, but that's not always the case. So there's a couple of different economic phenomena that mean that it's not the case. So I'll talk about economic rent and more broadly economic surplus, but also economic waste and economic damage. So economic rent, which Christine's already touched on, effectively describes a situation where somebody's getting money for nothing. So they're getting money because they own something, like a piece of property or the rights to an idea that already exists. So any money they get on top of effort they've put in, they're getting for free. So where that's the case, you can tax that without causing the same economic damage that you'd cause if you were taxing like the effort that somebody was putting in. But more broadly, there's this idea of economic surplus. So that's the idea that we work together to create wealth, and how much of a share we get from it depends not only on the effort we put in, but also on our relative bargaining power. And this isn't something that's absolute and set. This depends on like political relations, like laws, regulations, how the economy is set up. So if we change those things, we can change the distribution of wealth without necessarily reducing the overall amount of production. Then quickly, economic waste. So here I'm thinking of zero-sum activities like advertising or a bunch of companies fighting over the same market. They're effectively not adding anything to the economy. They're sort of fighting over something that already exists. So if we sort of try and discourage those activities and sort of push the economy towards more productive activities, that's good for the economy. And then of course, economic damage, things that are actively harmful, like tax dodging or pollution. It should be fairly self-evident that if we tax those, that both raises money and is good for the economy. So quickly, apologies if I'm repeating what was already said, but where we have high wealth inequality, because the rich are less likely to spend their money, redistribution here can also help the economy, because an economy where lots of wealth is concentrated at the very top is going to be more stagnant. And this is one of the explanations for the secular stagnation that we've seen since the 2008 financial crisis. And not only is this the case, but it's also true that high inequality can lead to like more inequality, because the rich use their money to buy up assets, which means that ordinary people have less of a chance to build up their own wealth. And so you get a higher concentration of wealth and even more stagnation. And what this means is that we can't wait for our economy to recover before we take action to raise taxes and make the economy more fair, because we won't get a proper recovery until we make the economy work more fair and work better. So I think waiting to raise taxes is the wrong way around. And then quickly, how this relates to the politics of arguing for tax rises, although our panelists are going to go on to talk about this. So normally the right has two main arguments against tax rises: one, that it will damage the economy, and two, that it's unfair because it's taking money away from hardworking people. So I think if we can build this narrative that says, look, when people get money, it's not always to do with how hard they've worked. Sometimes it's just to do with how powerful they are, because they happen to be wealthy enough to buy these assets at the right time, and because the system is increasingly getting more and more tilted in favor of the people who already have assets. I think that can be a powerful argument in favor of increasing taxes. And obviously that argument isn't well understood at the moment, so I think we need to put work into building it. But I think that's something we can do, just as the right has done that for, you know, fairly complicated ideas like the Laffer curve that are now sort of part of the public imagination. I think we need to do this if we want to make the case for raising taxes. And quickly on the MMT debate, so I might get this totally wrong because I'm still learning about MMT, so please let me know if I get this wrong. But I think essentially the argument that people make is correct. So the argument is that the government can use its purchasing power where there's resources that are underutilized. It can use its purchasing power to bring those resources into production. This benefits the economy, it doesn't cause inflation, and it's like a win-win thing. I think that's true, and it has profound implications, but I think we need to go beyond that like the redistribution and the rewiring of the economy that we need to do needs to go beyond just the amount of redistribution that it's possible to do via that sort of spare capacity in the economy. And that's why I think it's relevant to talk about tax rises as well as money creation. So to sum up, I think that raising taxes can be good for the economy. It's a necessary part of fixing the economic mess we're in, making the economy work for people again and making lives better. So to me, it's like a no-brainer. Thanks.
Thank you, Shreya. And I'm sorry I dropped off. My internet connection is a little bit unstable. I'm back. And I thank you, by the way, to 89 people who are currently taking part in this seminar. Thank you for coming. We'll take some of your questions. Some of them are coming in now after the rest of the speakers. Before we do that, I just want to throw in one kind of consideration to the discussion. We are all talking about raising taxes. It's interesting in the Labour context that the ceiling for tax raising per annum in the most radical of the Labour manifestos was 89 billion. It was 50 billion in 2017. And as Gary introduced at the beginning, we're now talking about 300 billion deficit this year, plus an unlimited amount of money creation. So it would be interesting if people in their comments address the question of scale. How much are you trying? And we'll come. I'll throw questions at people. But the next speaker is Michell, an associate professor of economics at Bristol Business School / UWE Bristol. Joe, 8 minutes, please.
Thanks, Paul. I'd like to take up one particular issue which we're hearing increasingly on the left, which is the claim that government spending is not paid for by tax. Taxes don't pay for spending, and therefore tax increases may at best be unnecessary and at worst be actively damaging. And in the context of the recent Conservative proposed tax changes, we've seen the official Labour response, which, as Paul said, was Keir Starmer's spokesperson said it's absolutely the wrong time to be talking about tax rises. And I think that is obviously at least partially driven by the standard Keynesian understanding that in a economic crisis, which is at least partially driven by inadequate spending, you don't want to do anything to reduce spending further from the private sector. And that's absolutely correct. But this has angered some on the left who are interested in tax justice and inequality and wealth concentration. And those people are also absolutely correct to be concerned about those things. But there's a third group who I think are becoming increasingly visible and vocal, who argue against tax rises from a different perspective, again, from these two. And this is the view that I want to engage with here. So the starting point for this argument is that there's effectively no connection between taxation and the size of the public sector. So that government spending could be increased to any desired level, or so it's claimed, without having to worry about tax revenues to pay for that spending. Now, the logic is often presented in quite a convoluted way, but essentially it boils down to a simple observation, which is that the Bank of England, a public sector institution, is the issuer of pound sterling, the currency of the country. And as long as the Bank of England is willing to issue pounds on behalf of the government, then the government can spend without needing to tax. Now, this argument is technically correct in terms of the mechanics. The UK government will never run out of pounds. It can always issue new pounds. But despite this, I'm going to argue that the conclusion that taxes don't pay for spending is incorrect, because effectively there's a conflation of two different meanings of pay for going on here. So let me explain what I mean by that. Now, the first meaning of pay for is simply settling a transaction. It's well understood by everybody that when you make a payment in the supermarket, for example, this leads to changes in cash balances. The cash of the shopper, whether held as banknotes or as electronic deposits, will be reduced, and the balance of the supermarket will be increased by an equal amount. So payment in this sense refers to the mechanics of the transaction. Does the shopper have sufficient cash or an overdraft facility to purchase the goods? If not, the transaction can't take place. And given that a shortage of cash in the way that absolutely can constrain a shopper cannot constrain the government, it is argued taxes therefore don't pay for spending. What pays for spending is the issuance of cash by the Bank of England. Now, again, it's technically correct to explain the mechanics like this, but in my view, this is a narrow, mechanical, and ultimately misleading definition of what it means to say for the government is paying for something. Now, what really matters beyond these mechanics of the monetary system are the goods and services that are purchased with cash balances, whether a shopper's cash balances or newly created cash from the government. Now, the government can purchase goods and services in the economy without producing unwanted and in general undesired or unnecessary side effects if two conditions hold. Now, the first is that there's some slack in the economic system. By that, I mean there are unemployed or underemployed people and other means of production available to produce the goods and services that the government is trying to buy. And that is usually the case in most economies. And the second requirement is that the private sector, households and businesses, are willing to hold the extra money, the extra cash balances created by the government. Now, to the extent that those conditions hold, there indeed is a free lunch for the government due to its ability to issue new currency, to print pounds. And as I said, most economies do operate with slack. There are usually unemployed people. And for that reason, I am usually an advocate, almost always an advocate, in fact, of increasing aggregate demand through fiscal policy to reduce unemployment. But this capacity is not limitless. And eventually a point is reached where goods and services purchased by the government cannot be newly produced. And so you then have the government competing with the private sector to try and purchase to some degree, fixed stock of things, or at least a stock of economic resources that can be used to produce things. Likewise, the willingness to hold cash balances isn't limitless. At some point, those who end up holding newly created balances will either spend on goods and services, will purchase assets such as stocks and shares or housing, as Gary has very nicely explained earlier, or people may choose to hold other currencies. They may sell the pound and purchase other currencies. Investors may decide that they no longer want to hold pounds at the same volume they previously did. So these are the limits. And beyond these limits, the government must borrow or tax. And this is the sense in which tax pays for government spending. It makes economic resources available to the government that would not otherwise be available. So by levying taxes, the government can reduce the spending of some individuals. It can reduce spending on particular goods and services by targeting taxes on particular goods and services, or by targeting on particular income levels, you can reduce the spending levels of certain individuals. So by taxing those on higher incomes, the consumption on highly polluting, and we know there's a recent report this week by Oxfam about the degree of carbon emissions emitted by rich consumption, you can reduce that consumption, allowing more resources to be available for other activities such as building green infrastructure, providing for the consumption needs of care workers, and so on. Now, the climate emergency and the pandemic require a fundamental restructuring of the economy. The scale of investment needed means that we're going to have bottlenecks. This is inevitable. And we're going to have reductions in expenditure in some parts of the economy. If we want to insulate every home in the country, for example, we're going to have to install fewer new luxury kitchens every 5 years. I think those kind of trade-offs are fairly straightforward. It's therefore misleading and, in my view, unhelpful to claim, as some have, that a Green New Deal could be implemented without restructuring taxation, that we could do it purely on the basis of excess capacity and willingness to hold new cash balances. Now, the changes proposed by the UK Treasury, which allegedly are being considered by Sunak and others in the government, include aligning capital gains tax with income tax, removing additional pensions relief for the better off, and increasing corporations tax. These are progressive changes. They're long overdue. We would not be arguing to implement these as tax cuts in this situation if they weren't in place. So that's one way of thinking about whether we should argue in favor of removing effectively loopholes for the rich. So opposing these changes essentially means siding with wealth over work and with rich over poor. At the same time, we must continue to argue for fiscal activism. Claims that the pandemic-induced increases in public debt need to be paid back are simply incorrect. As Paul noted, the numbers just simply don't add up. You look at the kind of revenue you can raise from tax and you compare it to the kind of deficits that we're currently running. The deficit is going to be large until this crisis is over. Public debt to GDP is going to continue to rise, and that's exactly as it should be. That shows that the government is playing its role as insurance of last resort in the economy. But over the medium to long term, tax revenues and the size of the state can't diverge permanently. government as a share of GDP can't continue to rise indefinitely while tax as a share of GDP stays the same. So those who want to see a more effective state have to make a progressive case for medium-term reform of the tax system to remove loopholes for the wealthy, first of all, and first and foremost. And in my view, it would be far better for the left to focus on progressive tax reform on our own terms than to allow these, I think, misleading arguments to allow the tax base to be eroded, inequality to rise. And this opens the door to free marketeers to then starve the beast, to say, look, we've run out of money, Labour spent all the money, the deficit's too big, therefore we need austerity. That's what we must avoid. And this is the argument I think that the left should be making at the moment. That's my conclusion.
And thank you, Joe, for that. I'm now coming to Robert Palmer, Head of Tax Justice UK. Robert.
Great, thank you. So I'm not an economist, but Tax Justice UK is a relatively new organisation, and we exist to build political momentum in the UK for progressive tax reform. And so one of the things we do is take the great ideas that have been discussed on this call and build political and media and public support for those ideas. And I really agree with a lot of the conversation that we've had so far, that what we need at the moment is a rebalancing of the tax system to ensure that wealth and big companies are properly taxed. Because at the UK in the moment, they're really undertaxed, especially in comparison to those who go out and work for their living. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do as a campaign group before we really got started is to understand, okay, where is the public when it comes to some of these big questions around public spending, tax and wealth. So over the last 6 months, we've been running a major piece of public attitudes research. We've worked with Stevenson and the University of Sheffield, and it's funded by Friends Provident. We published the results a couple of weeks ago, and you can find them on our website, taxjustice.uk. And I'm just going to talk a bit about what we found. So we did 11 focus groups across the country and 2 polls both before and during lockdown. Now, some of it is perhaps unsurprising and is actually quite positive in terms of our findings. So the public is by and large fed up with spending cuts, fed up with austerity, and overwhelmingly people want to see higher public spending. When we asked about taxes, we found that almost half of the people we asked in our polls would personally pay more in tax. And there was really strong support for higher tax on the richest. So we found 74% of people argued for higher taxes on wealth. And actually, what reassures me is this matches similar findings from the Demos think tank, which had a report out yesterday, and they also found very similar things. As part of our research, we tested a range of potential ways of taxing wealth more, including ending the pension tax subsidy for higher earners, a net wealth tax, and taxing capital gains at the same level as income tax. We found clear support for all of these reforms. One of the things that was actually surprising is that 2019 Conservative voters were more in favour of a whole range of higher taxes on wealth than the general public. And so I think that just makes a really strong political case for this current government, but also for the Labour Party to start to make some of the arguments about why we need to tax wealth, why we need to be ending the arbitrary tax advantages that the wealthy get in our current tax system. Now, other areas we also found support. So, for example, turning council tax into a more progressive property tax, reflective of the actual value of the homes, as championed by the Fairer Share campaign. This also got majority support. As you can imagine, Labour voter support for higher taxes is also high. So I think the overall picture and political context is that when you go and ask the public what they would like to see, broadly the answer is, almost half of people would pay more taxes themselves, and the vast majority, including a clear majority of both Conservative and Labour voters, would like to see higher taxes on wealth. And some of the areas that we tested, in the kind of standard pre-budget leaks that you get, things and policy ideas that apparently the Treasury is actually considering. One thing that is also pretty universal is that people hate tax avoidance, and that actions to close tax avoidance loopholes get support at levels of sort of 80 or 90%. And overall, I just want to kind of repeat that this is really good news for those of us who believe in progressive tax reform. And you can bet that this government, and I imagine the Labour Party, keen as politicians are in focus groups and polling, will be hearing the same thing. I do think there's like one note of caution that came out of our research. And that's that the public has a really ambivalent attitude when it comes to wealth. And campaigners need to do a better job of listening to how people think about wealth and how they relate to wealth. And one of our important findings is, and this might seem simple, is that it's really important not to talk about wealth as though it's inherently bad. Wealth is not bad if you're someone who doesn't have any wealth. And under our current economic setup, wealth is seen by many as a key way of providing security for themselves and their families. We also found that people have quite a strong sense that we live in a meritocracy. And so when you ask about billionaires, in focus groups, you find that people can often be quite positive around billionaires and will often say things like, oh, well, they worked for their money. They earned it and they give back through philanthropy. And so I think it's important for us when we're talking about wealth to do it in a nuanced way. Now, one of the really important things for campaigners to remember is that projects like this really can help you understand the terrain you're working on. But the findings really shouldn't be seen as an endpoint. Instead, we need to be smarter about how we make arguments that, for example, we lived in a rigged and unequal society, and how a progressive approach to tax could change this. So I think right now, to sort of sum up where we're coming from, is that we're pushing for a rebalancing of the tax system so that we tax wealth and big companies more, but at the same time continue to ramp up spending, including support for those who are really struggling. And I think it's important for campaigners on the left, for progressive campaigners, to be making the case, both from an economic point of view, from a policy point of view, and from a political point of view, that higher taxes on wealth and on companies would be popular and would be a politically sensible thing for either this government or a future Labour government to do as we start to build back out of this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that. There's a ton of questions piling up. We've now got 91 participants, so thank you for that. Stay with us. The last speaker is going to be James Meadway, economist and former advisor to the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell. James.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the sort of introductions that people have done there. I think they've all fitted rather well together. I wanted to pick up on the kind of the political context and the broader context we're operating in now. Starting with Rishi Sunak's intervention this week. Not so much which I think is the most dramatic thing the government has done in the economy for a long period of time, not so much in terms of the size of it. The actual amount of money involved in the new job protection scheme is hugely less than the cost of furlough and hugely less than the total cost of the coronavirus so far. I think it's 190 billion pounds is the Treasury estimate up until the start of September. Furlough is about 40 billion pounds. The number doing the rounds, I think yesterday, was about 5 billion estimated for the cost of this new scheme. So it's not the size of the intervention there, it's what he said about it, in particular in Parliament in introducing the new scheme, and saying that this was something that was being brought in because we now know that we will face permanent changes to the economy and society as a result of COVID-19. And he's completely right about this. And I think it's quite important that we understand that he's right and understand that we also need to be at something like this point. If you're on the progressive or socialist or left side of the spectrum, I think we also need to start thinking in terms of these are permanent changes now, not this is something that we'll have to get through and then we'll kind of carry on. Which probably a lot of us might have felt at the start of the year. We'll do the lockdown, virus goes away, off we go. That is, I think, self-evidently by this point, not going to happen. But it's important to go through the consequences of that because I think it has a direct tie into what we say about tax in particular. And there are sort of three ways in which this has become permanent. I mean, the first one is, and this is the best possible case scenario, is we get rapidly to an effective, safe vaccine. We produce it and distribute it effectively to everyone. Long-term immunity applies, and we do all get something a bit closer to carrying on as normal. But I would say there are still permanent impacts from this, because a certain amount of the changes we've introduced, people are going to stick with. I would have thought there would be an increase in working from home if people just have a free choice about it. There will, as a result of the size of the recession, be permanent losses. There are businesses that are closed that are not coming back. There are jobs that are lost. There are permanent impacts on people's income from losing those jobs. We know that some of these things are permanent. But more likely is that we don't actually get to either a vaccine particularly quickly, or when we do get to one, producing and distributing the thing is an enormous sort of technical and logistical challenge of a kind that we've never really had to address in sort of modern history. I mean, it's, to get to herd immunity for the population with this coronavirus, you need about 60% of people immune at any given point in time. That's 40 million people in Britain. That's roughly how many people you need to vaccinate. If the immunity is not long-term, you have to keep doing this. You then have to source these vaccines. You have to get the materials needed to produce the things. All of these things are immense logistical challenges that impose huge costs on the economy, huge and permanent costs, if this is the world that we now have to live with. And the third thing, and I think this is where we are now, whatever the speculation is about vaccines, what happens in the future is, and that's exactly the point, is that this is speculation really. This is a world of very deep fundamental uncertainty that isn't going away. If we knew, given that we've had this sort of 6-month extension on various kind of protections and social distancing measures, if we knew at the end of that 6 months we could kind of dust our hands and get back to everything, it really wouldn't matter. You could borrow whatever you want, you can carry on doing whatever you want, you'd put social distancing in place, restart everything, and off we go. But we all know that isn't what it looks like. We don't know whether things end in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months. And that uncertainty becomes a fundamental part of how everybody thinks and how businesses operate and what do we do. Because you have to adjust to a world in which you don't really know what's going to happen in a more fundamental sense than we've ever seen. And we also don't know what the virus is going to do in the future. We don't know what other viruses. This won't be the last epidemic or pandemic we run into. The rate of epidemics and pandemics is increasing. This is a result of the environment we live in disintegrating around our ears. So this is the side effect of the thing. That uncertainty changes how people operate, and it appears as a cost. It appears as the fact that certain activities you're probably not going to be able to do as much of. Aviation is taking a real hit in this. That looks like a permanent change in what we're going to be doing. If you try going to the pub, it's screens everywhere, it's washing your hands, it's all of these things to try and introduce some elements of being able to continue normal economic activity, the kind of things we're used to, but with loads and loads of additional costs. And those costs can't be got rid of just by saying, let's spend some money. They are real resource costs. You actually have to change how people work and where they work. You actually do have to get people not going to the office so much and sitting at home working for as much as you can do that. These are all real costs. And because they're real costs, it is not something that you solve by saying, okay, we spend more money. We should be spending more money. There are things we need to spend money on, but we also have to change what we do. And I think Joe made the point very well, that if you're facing those sorts of constraints, it's not enough to just say, we can borrow and spend to do this. You also, if you want to do it fairly, have to specify how those resource costs will be met. You have to say who is paying for what and how it's going to be paid for. And we see this as a monetary operation, but there's a real resource change underneath. And if you want that to be done fairly and transparently in a way that everyone understands, and I think we all do, then you have to do something like that through the tax system. That's the best mechanism we have in trying to adapt to something like this. So in other words, it's not just spending and saying, what sort of world do we want to get to? What are the things we'd like to do? It is also, how do we manage what now look like necessary and permanent costs in a way that is fair? And there isn't another mechanism for doing this. Gary touched on, and other people have touched on, the kind of unfairness that's built in to quantitative easing, the problems you get with the sort of money issuing pattern to that. There is a kind of longer term issue, which Joe touched on, which is that if you say we're going to borrow, of course you can run, and you can argue, actually, you can make a very sound macroeconomic argument that the government should run a permanent deficit, that this is a necessary part of keeping economic activity going. But if costs have risen everywhere, and therefore in the future supply is constrained, to put it in rather conventional terms, that productivity growth is constrained, that things are just harder than they were, at any level of economic activity you want, however much employment you want, that deficit is going to have to be larger. And there is a point at which that becomes a long-term problem that you can't overcome if we're facing a world of permanent costs and permanent changes in how we have to operate. So there has to be a restructuring of the tax system to do that. And this is really, and I'll wrap up on this point, this is, I think, where at the minute that probably all of us aren't quite getting the politics of this right. I think the Labour position is understandable if we think this is a temporary crisis, because it makes perfect sense for the reasons people have given, right? There is no reason at all when real interest rates on government borrowing are 0 or below 0, there is no reason to say, let's all panic about the debt and the deficit. It doesn't matter too much. It's not really a thing. And it's also right in the Keynesian sense that if you're in a recession, we're kind of moving in and out of the thing. There's another peculiarity of the situation. But if you're in something like a recession, then of course government should be stepping in to try and get activity moving. The difficulty here is it's not just activity in general we want to happen. It has to be changes in how that activity takes place. And until we start to specify what that looks like, we will get other versions of distributing costs imposed on us. A simple version of this was Guido Harding, who's supposed to be running the sort of test and trace system, addressing questions in Parliament about this and talking about this actually non-existent moonshot testing, but let's pretend it's going to happen, and told the MPs that, oh, we charge people to take the test. Now, like, if you have to go to work and demonstrate that you do not have coronavirus, that's just a direct cost on you trying to do your work. And of course, it's going to be one that lands most on people who are lower paid because they're the ones who are more likely to have to actually attend their workplace. That's a version of how the costs can land in a way that isn't fair, that isn't just. And the only thing I think that we can, or at least the most immediate thing we have to correct that, is the tax system. So that, I think, is the context we need to get into. I think there's a risk that this kind of slowdown in productivity and slowdown in future growth is going to start appearing in some of the conventional forecasting models. I think the Office of Budget Responsibility is producing a forecast in October, November. The budget isn't happening this year, which is quite indicative in itself. They're going to produce an official forecast. It's not clear what they're going to do or how they're going to handle some of this uncertainty, but they've already revised down, after the crash a few years ago, Britain's long-term productivity potential. Faced with those sort of arguments about we now have this debt and things are slowing down, the way out of it has to look something like, okay, this is how we start to pay for things. This is how we restructure society. You don't have the option, the political space where you can say it doesn't matter so much, starts to look quite seriously squeezed. And certainly by 2024, it strikes me as highly likely we will still be going around versions of this argument. It is best to set the thing up now, start to specify now what that looks like. I think something like a commission on tax justice, where you take the whole tax system, Labour could set this up and run it and say we're taking the whole tax system and looking at every part of it and saying how we can adjust it to get more money out of that would be good. I think for the left in general, the agitational point about a wealth tax and the need to make sure wealth is taxed fairly in this country, particularly as a result of this crisis where there has been clearly so much hoarding of wealth taking place, is something that we need to look into too. But the broad point here is that we're no longer in a world where just there are monetary or fiscal solutions only to the crisis we're in. We're going to have to get into the real costs and saying what's the fairest way of handling those costs.
Thank you, James, for that. And thank you to everybody who's still with us. 89 people on a Friday night. It's an excellent result. Talking about tax and the details of it. There's some brilliant questions coming in. And what I'm going to try and do before I start going to specific ones is try and aggregate some of the themes. And I would really appreciate from the panel if you would give me almost like a quick fire 90-second answer to the following. When, if you're going to raise taxes, when? Because Annalisa Dodds, in the sense that, the when and the how much is actually quite linked. So I'm going to ask you when, how much, and for what effect, i.e. what would you do? Would it be wealth? Would it be income? Would it be VAT? I'd really like you to throw in your, you don't have to live or die by this. It would be great to hear what people think. Is there anybody proposing, saying to say, Labour, look, go into the next session advocating wealth taxes? So let's go back in the order, Gary, if you wouldn't mind coming back in, and we'll go in the same order, but really keep it snappy if you can.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So for me, there's basically four things can happen. One is the government can just leave the struggling people out to dry and let them figure it out. That would be terrible. The second is they tax the richest, which is what I've been campaigning for. The third is they tax the middle class. And the fourth is they print money. So I've made my argument against printing money here today as a pure solution. I don't want the struggling people to be left out. Basically, it has to be, do you tax the richest or do you tax the middle class? For me, I think you have to find a way to tax the richest. The very richest people have penned themselves into a corner where they are untaxable. If we allow that to happen and we tax the middle class instead, all that's going to do is make the rich even richer over the longer term, and they're not going to get any easier to tax. So at the moment, we haven't really figured out a way to make these guys taxable. So we need to figure that out. So for me, I would say we can't do it right now, but what we should really be prioritizing is understanding how to make these guys taxable, because that problem is not going to go away. So I wouldn't suggest taxes right now. I would suggest building up an understanding and a system of how the richest avoid taxes and making sure that they pay it.
And Raven Hart, one of our people in the Q&A who works for HMRC, points out that there has been this huge drop-off in interest in closing down tax havens. If you remember in 2008, Gordon Brown, G20, there was a big multilateral push, and she asks, you know, we need international cooperation and transparency for domestic tax policies to be effective. How can this be achieved? Has the Overton window for global cooperation against corporate tax avoidance been opened or even closed? That's a theme as well I'd like the panel to consider. But coming to Christine, if you don't mind, just try and focus on when, if soon, is it wealth or income, and how much?
So, I mean, I think for all the reasons that everyone said, and I kind of set out my views on this as well, I think, in what I said, I do actually think now is the right time to be talking about tax rises. I don't buy this argument of you have to wait until the economy's recovered and then you start thinking about taxes. I think economically there's good reasons to do it now, actually, like particularly, you know, if you are talking about taking money away from the asset wealthy and spending it on things that are going to help essentially the asset poor, or are going to help to create jobs, are going to help to support demand. I think there's a very sound economic case to be made actually for doing that now. And I think some of what other people have said has also highlighted that regardless almost of what you do with the money, actually there's good economic reasons for just taking money away from the wealthiest, full stop, because they're using it to drive up the price of assets that poorer people depend on, right? So that also answers your how or your what question, I guess, like everybody else. I think we're talking about taxes on wealth, and of course there are all kinds of issues about how achievable or how doable those taxes are in the context of tax avoidance, and to what extent do they need to be done on a global basis. I think there's probably other panelists better placed to address those questions than me. I think from what I've heard, there are those that actually think, again, now is a sort of political moment of opportunity to reopen that conversation about global tax cooperation, precisely because these kind of shifts in public attitudes and this recognition that the burdens of the crisis have not been equally shared is happening at a global level and in other countries, just as it's happening in the UK. And I guess that's the other reason that I would advocate for tax changes now rather than at some mythical point in the future. Like, I think there is a political window of opportunity now to make changes to the tax system that are, you know, not about debates about the deficit and whether we need to pay down the deficit, but that are about equity, which is where surely the left wants the argument about the economy to be. And I guess this is why we called our IPPR report Who Wins and Who Pays. You know, as James was talking about, we're talking about the real economic costs of the crisis here, not the costs of government spending. But the reality is that the costs of the COVID crisis are being disproportionately borne by those at the bottom that can't afford it. And meanwhile, those at the top are either not bearing those costs, are being shielded from those costs, or in some cases are actively benefiting and doing quite well out of the crisis. And people get that that's unfair. They get that that needs to be rebalanced. And I think that just hasn't been part of the conversation, right? And this is why that you don't raise taxes in a recession frustrates me. It treats the economy as one bucket, and the left isn't talking about inequality. It's not talking about winners and losers, which is odd from the left. I think that's kind of what needs to change about the left's positioning on this for me.
So before I bring in Shreya, I want to throw in an anecdote, since there are a lot of books being written about the Corbyn era. James, you weren't there, but I was at a private dinner with big city people that John McDonnell did, where Labour people were trying to outline the basic offer, you know, the basic likelihood, if they came to power, of what kind of taxes they would do. And it was really interesting that the big city money was not that bothered about corporation tax, because, you know, cynically they can always avoid it. And even taxes on high earners, people looked around the table and said, we can, you know, we can see the social justice of that. It was the moment that wealth taxes were put on the table, and these were minimal. These were 4 billion a year, that the table erupted. Do this and there'll be capital flight. Forget, you know, FTT, forget wealth taxes, forget any attempt. So I think we need to bear in mind that, you know, all these discussions have to take place in the shadow of capital flight. And there's a number of questions, actually, very intelligent questions and apposite questions in the sidebar about what do you do about capital flight? Given that so many people in the panel are looking at wealth taxes, and given what I've just told you, what makes you think that we can load so much on wealth taxes? I mean, I don't know whether Shreya wants to come in on that, but can everybody else think about that? But Shreya, give us your two penneth on when and what you would do.
Sure. So, like in a like purely technical sense, like do it now. In a practical sense, we have to build the arguments first. So that obviously takes time. In terms of how much, like well above what was in the last Labour manifesto, like we need something on commensurate to the scale of this crisis, and the wider systemic economic problems. And then in terms of how, tilted towards assets, not income. And in terms of the point you just made, I think firstly we can tax things which are immobile, like property. Secondly, we can, you know, do taxes that are designed to act against that, like destination-based taxes or unitary taxes. So, but yeah, I agree, it's a really difficult problem.
Joe.
Okay, when, who, and how. As a first answer to when, I would say not now, actually. So I'm going to take a slightly different line because of the usual Keynesian argument, we're in a crisis and that is not the time to raise taxes. However, in terms of unjustifiable tax loopholes for the rich, I say that you close those at any opportunity. And if we have the opportunity now to do it, then we do it now. If the Conservatives are thinking about closing these tax loopholes, and if they need to say to their side, well, we're doing it to pay off the corona crisis, well, we know that's not true, but if they need to say that, you know, let them do it. Who should pay and how? I'm going to actually take a slightly different line. I'm all for taxing the wealthy, but I actually am not convinced that wealth taxes are the best way to do that. For one reason, it's harder to find wealth. And you do have the issue that, you know, some people do get wealthy through no fault of their own. You do have this, you know, income poor, asset rich problem. The person who just happened to buy a house that went up in value, and it wasn't a plan. It just happened. And there are other reasons I could expand on later. But so for that reason, I would like to see a very well streamlined income tax system. And I think you could get the wealthy basically by, you know, their income streams and their spending. You could get most of what you wanted to get to. So that would be my 90 seconds or slightly more.
Thank you for that. And James, before I come to you, I've got one of our participants, Patricia Pino, is saying, you know, she has a concern over accepting the tax to fund public spending narrative, which is dominant. If we defend the need to balance the books, this will always be weaponized against the poor. You know, we'll be running with our clever solutions, but I would add to Patricia's point, you know, everybody in the world can see the two great powers, China pump priming, spending money, soft credit, Trump actually cutting taxes and funding and financing it by monetary expansion. And in that situation, for the left to be saying, hey guys, we've got a different view, let's tax the rich, which inevitably, you know, creates the spectre of both capital flight and the possibility of suppressing demand. James, how would you, I mean, have your 90 seconds, but I'd also be really interested in, is there a danger that we are playing into the narrative of the fiscal austerians here? You're muted.
Okay, well, I'll start with that. 90 seconds. No, it's the other way around. I think it's the other way around for the reasons that Joe gave, is that if, you know, once you have a very large debt, it is used by people, the austerity side of the coin here, which are quite reduced by the way, in number. Their voices are not particularly loud at the minute. It doesn't mean they won't come back at some point, but it's not a thing that the Conservative leadership is talking about, very explicitly saying we don't want to do austerity. That is always used as a thing to then beat the left with and then to whittle away at the state with. That's how the thing works. That's the sort of political dynamic of it. So you've got to break that. You can't just say, oh, well, actually, secretly you could just run this thing forever. And by the way, just the point in the US and China is that if you're Britain, you can't do that. That's kind of the really, if you've got the dollar, you can print dollars, you can borrow stuff. We've seen this happen for 40 years. You do whatever you want. Reagan, not a noted socialist, ran massive deficits. George W. Bush did exactly the same thing. Trump running massive deficit. You can do this. Every other country in the world without access to the inordinate privilege of having the dollar and being able to issue it, particularly when you have a very large globalized financial system, as we still have and will continue to have in this country, has a serious risk of an exposure there, an exposure to kind of international political pressure of the sort that we saw briefly during the last crisis. And I'd recommend Adam Tooze's book, Crashed, for the ways in which central banks can apply pressure and not apply pressure to otherwise supposedly sovereign currency issuers. So no, I don't think it's a good idea to get into that. I think we've got to break the political cycle this implies. And also I'll come back to this point about the real costs of this thing. It is, if we are in a world, or getting into a world, where growth in the future is, and everybody will admit this, going to be lower than it was in the past, then I think the difficulty of arguing that we can still produce growth because the government is spending money is that it's just not going to look plausible. You're going to find your political space close more and more down if you're trying to do this. So we have to set up some argument on tax now in order to deal with what seems likely in the future. Everything economically looks like a downside from this crisis. There isn't some magic upside where that argument becomes easier in the future. It all looks like a downside. So we have to argue in those terms now. Two separate things finally. Look, if I was Labour, I'd set that argument up by actually setting up a commission and tax justice or something similar and park policy decisions for 6 months or 12 months, but set out some principles and point to them if you're pressured on this. And that kind of gives everybody something to do and also gets you a political win in building some consent around it. And if you're the left, I think we need to be quite agitational and pick some like very, very clear, easy wins. Capital gains tax, income tax, equalisation is a really obvious one. The IPPR has done very good work showing how much money you can get out of this. But there's a few other bits and pieces on it. I'll leave it on that.
Robert, I inadvertently skipped you. Can you use some of your expertise from the polling and campaigning side of things to just answer the basic question: what, when, and with what effect are we looking at?
Yeah, so I think something to really think about is the politics of this. We have quite a lot of political momentum and sense of solidarity coming out of COVID, and I think you can see that in all our polling numbers. And in fact, we found that Conservative voter support for higher taxes went up during lockdown. We're also going to have an election in 4 years. So the window of opportunity for this government to do tax rises is not that broad. It's, probably over the next couple of years politically. And I think the way of advocating is not to say we should have higher taxes on wealth. I think we should be advocating by saying, let's close the unfair advantages, the arbitrary advantages that the wealthy have in our tax system. And I'm paraphrasing the Conservative manifesto there. So I think if we use this language of loopholes, we use the language of taxing similar things in similar ways, that is a politically smart way of doing things. I think there's also a technical point, which is the capacity of HMRC to do things quickly is pretty limited. So if we're talking about what tax rises we could do now, things like capital gains tax, we could do that now. And with capital gains tax, what's really important about that is there are actually massive differences in the effective tax rates of those at the very top. So there are some really rich people, bankers, lawyers, who will be paying close to headline rates. And then 10% of those earning £1 million pay less than 15% in tax. So I think we can also make an argument about who we're targeting there. Higher corporation tax, that is another obvious example. Corporation tax is on profits. Not many companies are making profits now. Those who are probably the ones we want to be taxing. And then I think we also need to be really careful that we're not talking about overall tax rises without making sure that we're also spending more and supporting those at the bottom. And so if you're poor, things like your universal credit rate or child benefit are really important. And so I think like the politics of it means that there is an opportunity now and public support now to do some of the things that we want to. I would have probably avoid a framing of like, let's let's tax the wealth lots more, and more thinking about let's close down arbitrary advantages, let's tax similar things in similar ways, and we can do this now.
Great. Well, look, thank you for everyone for coming in so succinctly. I'm going to go to people are talking about a tax justice commission or whatever, but there are a number of questions in the sidebar about how do we explain this, and so I know sort of professional economists don't have to explain things in the sense that, you know, it's either true or false. But I'd like does anybody want to put their hand up for having a go at, given what we've said, and there is a consensus towards front loading some wealth orientated taxes, whether it's now or at the first opportunity. How would you answer the question, rather than the old question, we need to balance the books, which is, you know, the household finance thing, that other countries are doing this without raising taxes? What would you say to a voter? Anybody want to pile in?
All right, I'll jump in. I think this needs to be understood in the context of where we're in pre-COVID, right? We had the crisis in 2008, which is every single year the economist said we'd come out of it next year. It's 10, 12 years in a row, right? So we are in a situation of long-term economic emergency measures, right? The zero interest rate was supposed to be an emergency measure. And that is because the central bank is unable to get people spending. And that can clearly be explained as a result of inequality. If you give all of the assets to the rich people, they will save it. And it means the rest of us will be poor. And it's the rest of us that drive the economy without spending. So you have to just address the reality of people's lives. If you give all the money to the rich people, of course housing will be unaffordable. Because what the rich people buy? Houses. And of course your wages will be low, because that's what ordinary people buy, your wages. You need to make people realize that if you don't address inequality, that means no houses for your kids, no houses for your grandkids, no good jobs, the end of social mobility. So, you know, you talk about capital flight, and that's a really, really important issue. Taxing the rich is difficult. I don't come out here to tax the rich because I want to tax the rich. I say it because otherwise it's another 12, 24, 36 years of long-term economic stagnation. So it's not going to be easy, but it is the only way to prevent this economic stagnation. That is what we need to be explaining, basically. That if you want your kids to have houses and jobs, we need to address inequality. We need to address this issue of capital flight. And if we don't do that, it's not going to get any easier, because these guys aren't getting poorer. So, yeah, you know, it's not easy, but it's important.
Panelists, just switch your mic on to speak.
Shall I jump in and say something
Yeah.
here? I think what Robert was saying is very important here about how we present this. And I think one possible way of presenting it is simplification. I mean, I was on a radio interview a week or so ago with somebody from the Taxpayers Alliance, and they were saying, what they always say was, you know, we need to simplify, we need to get rid of red tape. There are all these different bans. We just need to, you know, make it all kind of one size fits all. So the presenter had their wits about them and said, okay, well, let's get rid of the special relief for people on higher earnings for their pensions. That's a simplification. You know, what possible justification is it that somebody on low earnings gets less tax relief on their pensions? And immediately this person was floundering and had to say, well, no, simplification is good, but I don't like this particular simplification. But I think there are the kind of closing the loopholes kind of thing. We can, there's a kind of dual way of framing it. And one is that this is just unfair on any basic level. You know, this isn't resentment, or it's just, you know, people who are working hard and on low incomes are paying more tax than the other people, and we can simplify the system. And I think it's very hard to make a coherent argument against that, particularly if you're on that sort of flat tax kind of side of the argument already.
I'm just going to jump in here. I think we can make it, I think there's a simple way of saying, after COVID, we're going to need to be spending more money. And in order to be spending more money, that is probably going to involve some tax rises. And if we're going to have tax rises, those who've got the most should contribute the most, particularly given they've done quite well during COVID. The poorest should be protected. And also, as a politician, I know that you're worried about tax avoidance. We are going to clamp down on the multinationals and the big companies, because we do understand that it makes you annoyed that you're paying your taxes, and wealthy people and big companies can get away with it. I mean, I think, you know, and MMTers would obviously hate it if I link directly spending and taxing, but I think, like, what is the most powerful political argument for higher taxes? And it's, you know, we will spend more, we will level up, we will help provide the services you need in your communities. And I think that's probably the most powerful political argument. I think tackling inequality is an important argument and is perhaps a second one. But I think, you know, the way politicians in the past have argued for tax rises is by saying you're going to get more stuff. And I think you need to be a bit careful about being too transactional with it. But you can, you know, if you want to be more fluffy, you can talk about the positive vision of where we're going to be going. But I think that kind of basic argument is really important, and people will get it. So Demos also produced some public attitudes research yesterday, and people get that argument and will be making it, you know, that's what they were saying to the researchers.
I'm not an MMTer at all. I want to just make clear this, but I want to just throw in a historical analogy to, and maybe people on the panel would respond to it. So in the 1929-31 crash, when the British Labour government had to deal with you know, something like a 20-25% unemployment, a really rapid slump, the argument put by the economic left, which at the time was Keynes, obviously, it was Oswald Mosley, who at that time was a Labour politician, and it was also sort of empire protectionist autarchs, was this: the whole past has been what they called expensive money. That is, the government debt was yielding something like double-digit returns to rich investors. So you get the whole Downton Abbey situation, you know, the whole lifestyle of Downton Abbey is effectively underfunded by the government paying massive interest rates on its debt. And the argument then was, if we reduce that and we make money cheap, then we suppress the wealth of the rich. We force the rich to stop relying on lending to government, and instead they have to invest and grow the economy. Now, right now, as you know, yields on gilts are zero or thereabouts and about to go negative. I do think there is an argument that is the same as in the 30s. That is, even at 0%, that's expensive money if you are wealthy. If we were to pursue a policy of negative, aggressively negative interest rates on bonds, it might have the same effect. So although being not an MMTer, I'm pretty aggressive on monetary policy as a left-wing tool. And I think that my problem with what everybody's saying tonight, and I welcome if anybody could respond, is that what the last 10, 12 years have shown is that monetary policy is such an easy and decisive tool to use. Why are we trying to do such difficult stuff at the level of, I can see the redistribution element, absolutely, Gary's point, but the macro effect of monetary policy is always going to be something like 6 times on current figures, 6 times worth of monetary policy is what's possible compared to what is possible at the level of fiscal. I mean, have you got any, or James, because you're both fairly skeptical about this. Do you want to pile in?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
The problem, the issue with, I mean, once we get into a world where negative interest rates can happen, the problem you're up against is how negative does the interest rate have to be to get rid of coronavirus? And it's like, what, infinitely negative, right? There is no negative interest rate that can deal with that. There is no, and that's even before you get onto the obvious distortions that appear with negative interest rates about how people save and this sort of thing. It's not something that starts to address this particular question. It's not something that the autonomous actions of a bond market, even if you're making it do something weird, like here you go, negative interest rates, that's what we're going to do. We're going to jam it this way. It's not something it solves by itself. So then you're into like, well, can we do versions of QE? Can we do some sort of credit guidance, this sort of thing? We've seen the kind of crude version of QE. Gary talks about it very well for the last like 10 years or so. I mean, basically it means asset prices go up and inequality rises, right? And it does not actually give you that much real useful economic activity out the other side. You can start to kind of concentrate. You can start to say, oh, okay, let's try and direct it in certain things we like, which is actually now starting to happen a bit, right? And there is a case for doing at least some of this. You know, you see the ECB buying bonds from the EIB, this sort of thing. The Bank of England's actually doing some of this stuff. So you can kind of steer it a bit, but it still doesn't address the final part of the problem, which is actually we're going to have to get real resources from different parts of the world, from this country, and reassign them. And the tool that the government has to do that is one part is taxes. And actually, this is why I think a lot of what we need to do is not going to be taxes. It's going to be versions of industrial strategy and versions of democratization and legal changes to how companies operate, right? So they're going to have to take account of changes in the world. That's two separate parts of taxes. But until you've got that lever of being able to steer things a bit and do so in a fair way, it's only a sort of tax fiscal policy end of it that can do that. Monetary policy, as we know, because money's quite weird, just produces all these other extraneous effects that are really, really not helpful for us.
So I quickly just make a couple of points as well. I think a very important difference between now and the 20s is that was the period towards the end of the gold standard, and that period of expensive money was to do with currencies being linked to gold, which did restrain governments in a way that they're not currently restrained, and meant that high interest rates on government debt could be a kind of redistributive mechanism which were regressive. I'm not convinced about negative rates on government debt as a kind of euthanize the rentier strategy, because I don't think that those rent streams are the main rents that we should be worried about. It's not, people aren't getting rich from holding government bonds at 0.5% or 1% or whatever. It's holding Amazon stocks and capital gains on real estate and this kind of thing. And just one final very practical point is pension funds are already in serious trouble because of the state of government bond yields. If you push them aggressively negative, you would have a real problem in your pension system, which you would need to fix. I think if you were to fix, for example, a pension system and go back to an old-fashioned through the state pay-as-you-go type system, then the demand for government bonds would shift substantially, and a lot of the kind of weird financial things we're currently seeing would kind of fix themselves anyway. So I think treat the problem rather than the symptom, and then some of the symptoms might also go away.
I want to throw one of the questions in. Somebody asks, I've lost it now, but if we're going to think aggressively about taxes, hypothecating, above all for this health and social care, which is the big unsolved, I mean, it's exacerbated by COVID and will go on be exacerbated by COVID. The health and social care system is the strategic problem of British, fiscal policy. What about does anybody support hypothecation? Or does it matter?
Should I? I mean, sometimes in a way, because it solves a political problem. There are two. God, the issue with hypothecation, usually from the left, is you say this destroys the collective basis of the tax system. That once you start saying your taxes are doing this thing, then everybody else can start saying, well, I don't want it to do that thing, so we shouldn't be paying for these people, and suddenly the universality of it disappears. I think there's elements of a solution to that is exactly as you say on health and social care, but doing something like setting up what would be initially a government-funded sovereign wealth fund or something similar. There was going to be a long-term system of funding for health and social care, which in formal terms would actually in practice be a kind of version of hypothecation, at least for its initial period, right? Because that's really what a thing is doing. It's just government paying money in a certain way from money coming in a certain way. And that would be one part of it. The other bit is something that we flagged, John McDonnell talks about doing, but it never made its way into either 2017 or 2019 manifestos, which is what they do in some of the Scandinavian countries, which is basically have public tax records once you earn over a certain amount, that you just declare how much you earn, you declare how much you pay. It's a massive anti-avoidance measure because everybody can just see what you've got. And it kind of also reinforces the idea that paying taxes might actually be a good thing. It's like, this is my contribution. It's a big sort of cultural shift that starts to help there. So that might be one, I think it's one idea worth revisiting at some point.
Because of time, I'm going to go to summing up. what I'd love for people to do is to think, rather than reiterate their arguments, is to think forward about what's the concrete thing we can do to try and frame this debate. Robert, you've raised some points, but I'd love for some of the other people on the panel. I'm going to go in reverse order and start with James Meadway and work back to Gary. But please, 1 minute each about how do we shape the debate going forward about it. If we've got a rough consensus, what should we do?
That's I feel I've spoken quite a lot, so I'll keep it very brief. I mean, it's a very good question about, well, how do we win this one? I mean, as Robert says, and people know, that the argument to a large extent, at least in terms of general public perception, is being won for us. I think it requires a degree of organisation and movement building and the usual things about how you win a public argument to actually start presenting these things. I think the left in general needs to get on the front foot about saying, actually, we're going to talk about taxes and we're not going to mess around saying you don't have to pay or whatever, that we need to start doing this. And that once, I mean, this is why this particular event is useful, because it's trying to get out into a particular set of arguments. I think more things like this, and maybe some clarity about what taxes we're going to talk about, would be helpful. I mean, if you just say wealth tax, it's not, it's too open to everyone just going, oh, well, what about this? What about, are you going to steal everybody's houses or whatever? Just pin them down in some clear demands and say, these are the first things we want to do going forward.
Rob.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, like the clearest argument for higher taxes is you get more spending. I also think we need to be making the cases of sort of closing down loopholes and being really careful in our framing how we talk about wealth. And I think there's a much bigger job the left has to do to convince people that a lot of wealth is earned unequally, unfairly. We don't live in a meritocracy, but in like where we are now, the public doesn't believe that. So I think we just need to be careful when we're talking about higher taxes and wealth, how we frame and how we make that argument, using some of the types of argument, for example, that Gary was making.
So, Joe.
Very quickly, I don't have a great deal to add on this one, but I think one framing that might be useful would be sort of security and freedom. I think a lot of people feel insecure these days, even people on decent incomes, reasonably good consumption standards, have the sense that the rug could be pulled at any moment, and taking away that sense of precarity alongside an argument in favor of taxation, I think could be an important thing. Saying you're going to get something out of this. You're going to not worry about when you're old. You're not going to worry about your children going to university. You can relax, and that's what you get from, closing some loopholes and reorganizing things a bit.
Shreya?
I think what I'd add is about like coming up with more sort of policy ideas that achieve like the radical things we want to achieve, while also not aggravating people's senses that, oh, this is really unfair because why am I having to pay higher taxes when they're not having to pay higher taxes? And you're not sort of suddenly destroying someone's life savings, and you're not aggravating the capital flight problems that you're talking about. So how do we deal with those things practically? I think there's more thinking to be done there.
Christine.
Yeah, I guess, my sense at the moment is just that there is this real political window of opportunity to talk about, and I think specifically about this frame of equity and fairness. I know Robert said, obviously, the easier case to make is you tax so that you can spend money. I actually sort of agree that, you want to be a little bit careful with reinforcing scarcity frames and austerity frames, given the political context of that. I mean, it's worth noting that that's not where the Labour Party is at right now in its positioning in terms of opposing tax rises being proposed by the Tories, right? It's sort of very keen to be seen as fiscally credible and is actually making a lot of arguments about how they're using public money inefficiently and blah, blah, blah. And then it's also saying you don't raise taxes in a recession. So it's kind of almost the mirror opposite of that is the position the Labour Party is taking. But I just think in terms of where the public is at, and in terms of where we want to get to, the kind of equity frame and the fairness frame, and just relentlessly focusing on who's bearing the cost of the crisis and who's not, and the fact that that is currently not fair and that those burdens need to be rebalanced. I think there is a real opportunity to make the case for tax rises right now on that basis. And I think the Tories understand that. And what is like tragic and frustrating to me is that very few people on the left seem to either understand that or kind of be willing to push for that. And And I think there will obviously be forces on the right pushing against tax rises. And it's just tragic to me that the left is kind of adding their voice to that chorus at the moment, which is why I'm glad that we had this meeting.
I'll finish with Gary.
I think that we need to reach out to people, and we need to understand the situation people are in and what people want. I think often economics, to me, it often feels very, very middle class, and it feels disconnected from what's happening to people. Listen, people out there, they want financial security. They want to be able to get a house. They want decent jobs, and they're not getting it. And they're not going to get it unless things change. And that was even before COVID, and it's just getting much worse now. So for me, I go out there and I say tax the rich, but it's not because I want to make the rich people poor. It's because I want ordinary people to be able to get houses and get wealth. So when we talk about wealth, it's not bashing rich people. It's about giving ordinary people a chance to get that wealth, you know. So, you know, we shouldn't attack it. We should be out there saying we are the only way for ordinary people who are getting cut out of society to have a chance. So, you know, I think sometimes the way the left talks about wealth is way too negative, because ordinary people want the chance to get it. Look, we've got it often, economists, we have housing. They don't. So stop attacking rich people and start saying we're going to help people get financial security because they're not getting it now.
Well, on that, thank you to everybody. There are 78 participants still. Thank you for sticking with us on this Friday night. Tax can be interesting. It's like Monty Python, accountancy is not boring. Tax policy is actually not boring. And I think we've had a great example of it tonight. There is a recording of this. I hope our colleagues at Autonomy can capture it and maybe publish it. Everybody who's been, I hope, will be able to get a link to what we said. This is a completely ad hoc thing. Autonomy and Left 2030, which is just a website I run, have put it together at short notice. But I think we've got the basics of an argument here, and I hope that we can all collectively and individually pursue that into whatever parts of the labour movement and the wider progressive movement that we are part of. And with that, I will say thank you very much. Enjoy your Friday night and have a great weekend. And thanks to the participants.